Welcome to Surrender School. This is the 2023 Step Study. Session A.
All right. Welcome. I am so happy to see all of you. It is so fantastic to be doing this. I cannot tell you how excited I am to be going through this study guide with all of you. There's nothing more beautiful than going through the steps in all kinds of different ways, and because it just enriches my program so much. And I learn every time I do it. I learn more and more and more. Okay, so just a couple of my own little housekeeping things. Like Cher said, the assignments are on the website. At the end of each session, I will tell you what the next homework is. Now, we want to be mindful. We wanted to be mindful about everybody's got a life. Lots of people work. There's kids. There's all kinds of stuff. And so we tried to keep the homework to a minimum this time. And so that was the feedback from the last step session that we did, was that there was too much homework and people couldn't get it all done. And so what we did is the homework is just going to be the pages in the study guide. There'll be lots of additional, like optional homework you can do if you have time and are so moved to do so. But really, all we're asking you to do is to read the pages in the study guide for the next session. So it should be pretty doable. And in the interest of being as close to the study guide as possible, like this isn't Linda's way through the steps. This is going through Lori's book of the study guide. And I want to be as, as close to that as possible. So I want to tell you kind of where we're going to go here. Today is just an introduction. We're not going to be starting in on the steps today. Obviously, that's me talking today. Then step 1 for the next session is me again. And then session 3 is Lori on step 2. And then it's me for step 3. And then there's 4 sessions on step 4, and Lori is going to do all of those. Then there's going to be 1 session on steps 5, 6, and 7, and that'll be me. And then Lori will do the next session for steps 8 and 9. And then it's going to be me again for steps 10 and 11. And then Lori will do step 12, and then I'll do a conclusion session. Okay, so that's kind of how we split it up. Are there any questions on any of that before I start diving in? I'm so excited. Okay. All right. Now, the way that I want to stay close to this and also keep it within the time period, because I tend to ramble, I'm going to try and just read sections and then comment as I go. All right. So in order to follow along, the pages that I'm going to be reading from today are pages 2 and 3. And then I'm also going to be reading from pages 69, 70, and 71, because we're going to go over the provocations today. That's what I wanted to introduce this step study with, because I thought they were fascinating. So first, I just want to introduce the step study through Lori's words. On page 2, under the section, This Step Study, he says, those of you familiar with the well-known AA team of Joe and Charlie will recognize much of what I say here, although I base this study on my own experience, of course. Virtually all of this step study is based on what I have learned from the great AA speakers, Joe and Charlie, Roger and Blaine D. from Winnipeg, Canada, and a lot of reading of AA history and experience. I don't think much of what I have to say is particularly original. I therefore want to acknowledge the teachings of AA and of those who have given their time and effort and experience to convey the message of recovery to those who still suffer. And so this is basically his philosophy for doing this study guide. It's his experience with the steps and all of the wonderful speakers that we have to listen to, everything that we can learn out there. There is so much recovery material out there for us to learn from. And that's one of the things I love about program. And as much as I have problems sometimes with technology, one of the best things to come out of it for me is all of this great recovery stuff that I have access to now. So that's kind of his philosophy. And then the next section is titled The Big Book. And so this is not the OA 12 and 12 way of going through the steps. This is the Big Book way of going through the 12 steps for those of us in food recovery. So OA stands for the proposition that the 12 steps give us freedom from the bondage of food. And this next sentence is a sentence that changed my life forever. If the steps aren't working for you, then maybe you're not working the steps in a way that works for you. That sentence right there blew the door open on my recovery. And it gave me permission to find the way to work the steps that actually worked for me. And that allowed me to get into recovery. After 25 years in relapse, that's what opened the door for me. Then he says, it might therefore be worth it to try the approach to the steps used in this step study based on the Big Book. The Big Book was written as a set of directions for doing the steps. It was aimed at those people who would not be able to meet anyone from AA, because at the time it was published, AA was centered in New York City and Akron and Cleveland, Ohio. So the Big Book was written as a do-it-yourself manual. As such, it is a textbook, a book that contains valuable information to compulsive eaters. It's not a perfect book, that's for sure. It was written by Christian male alcoholics who had found themselves in the gutter and had done a lot of harm to other people. It needs to be interpreted and applied. That's an important part. Interpreted and applied for people who did not have their exact same experience. And it sometimes needs to be clarified because of its 1930s language. Now, I like the language. It's rather lyrical and pretty, but it is different than modern day language, modern day speaking. But besides its being a great inspirational and loving book, it is one of the greatest textbooks ever written. And I hope you'll join me in the study of its directions. Now, the last thing I want to read in this kind of introductory period is on page 3, the section that he has on questions, because I'm going to be using these questions when I'm leading sessions. I'm not sure what Lori's going to do, but I may be using these questions. He says the questions at the end of each chapter in this Big Book study were part of the format of the original online step study on which this book is based. I hope they're useful questions. They are not intended, however, to be substitutes for actually doing the steps. Doing the steps is what the rest of this study is all about. So there are questions at the end of each chapter, and I may or may not ask them. I think it's worthwhile to do them yourself, whether you just think about them in your quiet time or whether you actually write them out. I think they're very useful questions. So now I want to get to the heart of what I wanted to do today, and that is the 12 provocations. I love these. They are so great for discussion, and they're really great to think about. So they're listed there on page 3 in the yellow box of the study guide. But I'm also going to read from his comments on them in pages 69 through 71. So his first provocation is, I am a recovered compulsive eater, not a recovering one. And this is what he says about that. This is how he kind of explains how he came to these kind of provocations. He says, in relation to a person who has worked the 12 steps and is free from the bondage of addiction, the big book consistently uses the word recovered and not recovering. The word recovering is used only once, and then only to describe someone who is still working through the steps and is not yet free from the bondage of addiction. The big book uses recovered because that word shows a complete change in one's attitude. And this is an interesting point. He says, it is the advertisement to the compulsive overeater who still suffers. I no longer have the illness I used to have. True, it's a bite away. And true, it's a daily reprieve contingent on my spirituality. But right now, for the moment, I have recovered from a seemingly hopeless condition of mind and body. The compulsive eater who still suffers deserves no less from me. I am not full of pride. I am humbled by the clear knowledge that I was unable to accomplish this on my own. I had to surrender completely and admit that I was powerless, and only then could I begin to find the power that has caused my recovery. And the way I look at this is, I say to myself that I am recovered. I am a recovered compulsive overeater, but I am also recovering in that I am recovered from my food addiction, but I am recovering to my addiction to control life, to control people, places, and things. I am recovering in that I am still learning how to cope without using food to get through life. So I use both of those words, but I see his point here very clearly. People that come into our program are not playing around. They want to be recovered. And it is up to us to show other people that it is possible to be recovered. And so I really liked that provocation. The second provocation, abstinence is not the most important thing in my life without exception. The consciousness of the presence of God is. I love this. He says, he quotes on the big book on page 51, when many hundreds of people are able to say that the consciousness of the presence of God is today the most important fact of their lives, unquote. The point is that so long as I live on a spiritual basis, working the 12 steps, I am sane in relation to food. As long as I am sane, I am free from any temptation to return to the insanity of the food. Therefore, I am abstinent. It's not because I work at being abstinent. It's because I work at being sane. I loved that, because I think in our program, we get really hung up on the perfect food plan, and we get really lost in the whole food issue. And we don't understand that our solution is the spiritual awakening. It's our conscious contact with our higher power. And I think in our program in particular, we get lost a lot in the food. The third provocation, although a sponsor, if available, is very important for recovery, a sponsor is not necessary to recover. Now, when I came into program, that would have been sacrilegious to say that. So I thought that was a really interesting provocation. He explains it like this. The big book was written as a textbook for people who had no sponsors. Its instructions work even if there are no sponsors available. The point of this proposition is that no one should use the lack of sponsors as an excuse not to do the steps. No one should be dependent on another person for recovery. Amen. This is page 69, by the way, guys. Amen on that statement. I'm going to read it again. No one should be dependent on another person for recovery. If I depend on a sponsor, then where is my dependence on a higher power? Love that. I absolutely love that. He quotes the big book on page 98, quote, "We simply do not stop drinking so long as we place dependence upon other people ahead of dependence on God. Burn the idea into the consciousness of every man that he can get well regardless of anyone. The only condition is that he trust in God and clean house," close quote. Love that. Here's the fourth provocation. I love how he named them the provocations. All right. The fourth one, you can recover in weeks. That one kind of blew my hair back. He explains it like this. Lori says, it is possible for most people using the instructions in the big book to finish off step 9 within 2 months, 8 weeks, he says. If working the steps is a priority for you, and it certainly should be if you are a member of OA, you can make the time that's necessary. What, after all, takes time? Step 3 is a prayer said in a minute. Writing step 4 can take a week or so, but there's not a lot of writing using the forms that he provides in this study guide. Step 5, using those forms shouldn't take more than 4 or 5 hours. Steps 6, 7, and 8 are done on the same day as step 5. Step 9 may take a while simply because of the availability of people, but the bulk of it can be done very quickly. Then you should have recovered. Steps 10, 11, and 12 keep you recovered. I once went through the steps, all 12 steps, with someone in 12 days, back to back to back to back. He was on vacation, but it can be done. It can be done. And I think sometimes, well, for most of us, we get lost in step 4 and then we're gone and we never come back. We never make it back again. So I think doing it quickly has a lot of value, particularly for newcomers, so they can get some relief. Now, don't get me wrong, doing deep dives into the steps is one of my favorite things to do. So I love doing that, but I think there is great value in doing it quickly. Number 5, the tools of recovery are not an essential part of the OA program. He explains it like this. All OA stands for is the 12 steps of recovery. The tools pamphlet is helpful if a person has adopted a plan of eating and has not yet recovered. In that case, the tools provide things for people to do instead of eating compulsively. But the tools are not a substitute for the steps. And I have seen that a lot in program where, okay, I'm going to make my 3 calls a day, and that way I've used the telephone, and I'm going to write in my journal, and that's, and it just becomes a matter of ticking off boxes. And what that does is it makes program mechanical. And I once heard someone say that once you make your program mechanical, it loses its ability for transformation. And I really believe that. And that's why I love doing the steps in so many different ways, because it keeps it alive and breathing for me and growing for me. And I don't want my program to become mechanical. Now, that being said, I use a lot of the tools frequently, but it's not something that I have to do. It's something I do that helps me to work the steps. That's it. Number 6, you don't take steps 1 and 2. And he says it like this. Steps 1 and 2 are acknowledgement steps. I've heard them described as conclusions of the mind, steps that are conclusions of the mind. You study them to understand the problem, step 1, which is powerlessness, and the solution, step 2, which is power. But the big book has no instructions for doing steps 1 or 2. As a matter of fact, step 2 is not even mentioned as a step per se in the text of the big book, other than the list of steps on page 51. That one's really interesting to me. That's because I had to do a lot of work on both steps. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what Lori has to say on step 2. So when he does that session. All right, the 7th provocation. Steps 3, 6, 7, and 8 should not take a long time to get through. He says these are the steps which Bill put in to make certain there were no loopholes. You know, addicts, we can always find the loopholes. The instructions for them in the big book certainly indicate that they are not the huge steps that some commentaries have made. They are stations on the way. We have to pay attention to them and be conscious of them, but they should not take a long time if you work the steps the big book way. And I can say that I agree with that. And I can also say that taking deep dives into those steps is also a lot of fun and very instructive for me, particularly around my emotional sobriety work. When I've done deep dives into those steps, it's typically been around that kind of work for me. All right, provocation number 8. You don't make amends to yourself. Now, I know in OA, we spend a lot of time talking about making the first person on my list is going to be me. You know, I owe amends to me. And yes, we have been very abusive to ourselves. I agree with that. But this is what he said. And I thought that this was an interesting way of putting it. He says, we often hear the first person I have to make amends to is myself. And what that is code for is I have to learn to say no. I have to learn how to take care of myself. The big book is outer directed, not inward directed. Sure, you have to take care of yourself, but that's because you have an obligation to carry the message. And how can you carry the message well if you're not in good shape? And you should be saying no if saying yes would allow another person to come to harm, as it often does when people exploit your people-pleasing nature and they harm themselves by doing harm to you. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at that. So I really like the notion that really what we're doing is we have to learn how to take care of ourselves. And self-care has been a really massive undertaking for myself. But he's saying it's not about making amends to yourself. It's about caring for yourself so you can carry the message. And I really like that because it takes it out of the realm of selfishness, you know, and I have to take care of myself first. And to me, there's this weird tinge of selfishness to that. But, you know, kind of reformulating it or reframing it into the notion that I'm taking care of myself so that I can carry the message. And I like that. And I have to admit, you know, I'm a typical OAer. I mean, I had to learn how to say no, and I had to learn how to care for myself. And those were two things that I didn't know how to do when I came into program. So that definitely was my code for, you know, I have to make amends to myself. And I do say that, like, following my food plan is the way that I make a living amends to my body. I will say that. That is something I deeply believe in, is that is the way I make amends to my body, because I have treated my body horribly. All right. Provocation number 9. This was, and I've heard this both ways. You should not sponsor until after you have completed step 9. That's his belief. In this context, sponsor means carrying the message. And he quotes the big book on page 164, quote, obviously, you cannot transmit something you haven't got, unquote. If you have not recovered, you can still be helpful to people. I mean, and I absolutely believe that you can still be helpful to people. There are meetings where no one has recovered, and at those meetings, people help each other out. But the big book is clear that what appeals to the compulsive eater who still suffers is a person who has been there, but isn't there anymore. Someone who has recovered from a seemingly hopeless condition of mind and body. I've heard people say you can't sponsor until you've gone through all 12 steps. Well, you're living 10, 11, and 12 for the rest of your life. So that one doesn't make sense to me. I've also heard that you can sponsor people up to the level of where you are. And I think that that's true if there aren't people available. Well, I think that's true. But what he's saying is until you've gone through step 9 and have had a spiritual awakening and are recovered, you shouldn't sponsor until then. And I think that there's quite a bit of controversy on that. I'll let him talk more about that if he wants to. All right, provocation. That's why they're provocations, because we don't agree with all of this stuff. All of these statements are in and of themselves a bit controversial. That's why I thought it was fun to start with them. Okay, provocation number 10. Service is not slimming. I don't know, do they say that in OA meetings anymore? I remember hearing that when I first came in like 30 years ago. Service is slimming. And I thought it sounded like a 1960s commercial, but people do believe that. And what he's saying here, and I thought that this was really interesting, is he differentiates sponsoring or carrying the message from service. He says service, as I've discussed above, is to be distinguished from carrying the message through sponsorship and outreach. Carrying the message is one of the prerequisites for continuing recovery. As Dr. Bob is reputed to have said, clean house, step 10, trust God, step 11, and help others, step 12. Helping OA out is a way of making certain that OA carries the message as well. So there's service of coming in, opening a meeting, carrying a key for a meeting, being on service committees and stuff like that. But he distinguishes that from sponsorship, which I think is really interesting. I never made that distinction before. I've never made that distinction, but he does. And he says here, but there are service junkies in OA who think that doing service will give them recovery. And I have seen that in these rooms a lot. It doesn't, at least from the Big Book perspective. It provides the method for carrying the message, and carrying the message keeps our recovery because it's step 12. But steps 4 through 9 are what bring us recovery. It's what causes us to have our spiritual awakening. And doing just steps 1 and 12 will not bring about recovery. I've seen a lot in program. People come in and they become service junkies and they overcommit. And then they develop resentments, and then we never see them again. And I think it's really important that we have balance with our service and balance with our sponsorship as well. But just doing service alone isn't going to give you recovery from your compulsive overeating or food addiction. At least that has not been my experience. I've done a crap load of service all during times of my relapse, and it didn't get me out of the relapse. It's the steps and my spiritual awakening that got me out of it. And the 11th provocation: food can be discussed at meetings. And he quotes page 101 in the Big Book, quote, in our belief, any scheme of combating alcoholism which proposes to shield the sick man from temptation is doomed to failure, unquote. How do you think it would sound if at an AA meeting someone said, and then I picked up a glass filled with a yellow fuzzy liquid and drank it? That I would laugh. If people who have not recovered get uneasy with stories about food, then that's their problem. And if they eat over it, then maybe they'll get desperate enough to do the steps, which will bring them recovery. I've heard all kinds of descriptions of food circling around the actual name of the food in meetings, and everybody knows what you're talking about. So I don't think we protect anybody about it by saying a food. All of the other 12-step meetings actually talk about their substance or their process. And I think we need the freedom to do that too. Yeah, it's, hearing food mentioned at a meeting never caused me to eat. I was just gonna eat. The fact that someone said the word, I was long thinking about food before somebody else talked about it. So I would have to agree with that one wholeheartedly. And the last provocation, he says, and this is interesting. He says, every person who wants to be a member of OA should know exactly what having a desire to stop eating compulsively means. And he quotes the big book on page 96. He says, quote, "We find it a waste of time to keep chasing a man who cannot or will not work with you. If you leave such a person alone, he may soon become convinced that he cannot recover by himself. To spend too much time on any one situation is to deny some other alcoholic an opportunity to live and be happy," unquote. And he tells it from his own perspective of the story that happened to him. He says, "I was in relapse and was dying in this program. But if people asked me how I was, I would tell them fine. And they would say, great to hear that. Keep coming back. We love you. Love to hear you talk. One day, the shyest person in the room asked me how I was. But this time, when I said fine, she said, I mean, really?" And I fell apart and admitted I was in trouble. She was courageous and loving enough to confront me. And if she hadn't, I have no idea whether I could ever have emerged from relapse. I have a lot of mixed emotions around this. I spent years and years and years in program, eating my brains out, eating on the way to the meeting, thinking about eating at the meeting, and then eating on the way home from the meeting. And no one ever said anything to me. And now I never reached out. But I think there's a lot of fear in our program about talking to people, really talking to people about what's going on. And I understand we've all been abused culturally, medically, in our families, in our peer groups, about our weight. And there's so much pain around that. And being even lovingly confronted about where we are in our program can be really difficult. I will tell you that I would not be that generous to confront someone that I really didn't know. I have had occasion to lovingly confront people that I do know in program well enough that I feel I know well enough. But this is a really, really tender point. And I don't know what the right answer is here. I understand from his story the importance of being generous of spirit enough to ask someone that question. But I also understand, being a very wounded compulsive overeater food addict, that how that can be taken. And so I think that this is a really tender spot, and I have no idea what the right answer is for it. But I think it is absolutely worth conversation for us to actually have conversation about. So those are the 12 provocations. I'm going to read on page 71, I'm going to read his conclusion to his introduction. And then I want to open it up for questions and see where we go from there. Okay. Questions, comments, whatever. Okay. I'm going to read the conclusion on page 71. He says, the big book is tough. And I agree with that. It's down to earth. It doesn't mince words. I once heard something like this in OA. I love this. I love this. Truth without compassion is cruel. Compassion without truth is harmful. Certainly, everything we say has to be full of love and tolerance and compassion. But we harm people if we don't tell them the truth. And as people pleasers, many of us in OA may know how to do the compassion bit, but we shy away from the truth bit. So let's think about how we treat our fellow OAer who's still suffering. Are we killing that person with kindness? And that's all I've got for today.
Great. Thank you, Linda. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show you a little bit about the study guide page. Okay, this is the website, and the study guide page is right here. I'm going to click on that. I will let you know that the password for that page and the password will be enabled beginning Wednesday. And the password is surrender 2023 with a capital S. And Karen's going to share that in the chat. So it's capital S, the word surrender 2023 with an exclamation point. Right up top, you have two links. One is the study guide. If I click on it, you get all 96 pages if you go from the link at the top. You also have a link here to oabigbook.info. Takes you to this site. You click on it. This is the author's site, Laurie, who's going to be speaking with us. He has lots of resources here, many that are great. And because this page is going to be password protected, the Zoom instructions are right here. So if you don't get them, I usually send them every week, and it's the exact same every week as long as we don't get Zoom bombed. You can click right here. It will go to a link where you can join. We love sponsors. I said it yesterday at the Friendly Circle of Berlin. I'll say it again. We love you. That's why the hearts are there. If you are willing to sponsor for this step study, you are golden. We click here. You'll fill out this. This will also be shared in the chat, the password, and will be password protected because we're going to put people's names and phone numbers here, and they will come down here. Asks you some basic information. You can always add yourself, remove yourself, update your information, and anything you want sponsees to know before contacting you, you can write it there. Really hope to get some more people. I already got 2 since yesterday, so that's great. Let's go back to the step study page. The step study page is laid out the same for every session. You have directions for prior coming to this session. So today you were supposed to read, I mean, if you knew about this page, step study pages 2 and 3. When you click on one of these, you only get the pages that you need. So here's 2 and 3 right here. So let's just look at next week's session. So you came here, or you would watch the video. We'll be posting that soon. You do the reading. The main assignment for every single week is the reading. It's only a few pages, and then we have optional homework for you to go deeper if you're working with your sponsees. And we have some podcasts that are associated with the step that we also recommend. And then, I'll just show you, for like resentments, it's up to you if you want to go ahead and complete the steps as we go through it. And there's a form here. So you learn about the resentments in this session. You'll watch the video from the last session. If you would like to, or have your sponsees complete the resentment form, and then the other directions, read, optional homework. All right, that's it for the study guide.
So Linda, here's the first question is you talked about the sensitive topics, like in Lori's story where he said this woman came and talked to him. Could you give us some examples of the sensitive, basically more specific about the questions that are sensitive, maybe an example of something from your life?
So what has happened for me, the sensitive stuff in our meetings, if someone, okay, say, you know, when you go around the room and people are introducing themselves as sponsors and they say, you know, I'm maintaining a such and such weight loss or whatever, and I sponsor da 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 da. And you can clearly see that this person has put on 30 pounds or 40 pounds since the last time you talked to them. In that situation, of course, you're not going to do anything in the meeting, but after the meeting, obviously this person isn't okay. Okay. And the loving thing is to check in with them. But they're presenting themselves as maintaining this weight loss. And so do you see the sensitivity there? Essentially, I mean, AAers would be talking about calling out your bullshit, pardon my French, but we don't talk like that in our rooms. We don't tend to confront people like that. And you know, Lori's example was the perfect example where he would have just kept going along like that because people were letting him do that. They weren't calling out his BS. And to me, that's very sensitive in our program. If, you know, if I have come in and out of these rooms so many times at so many different weights, looking so different over the years, and no one ever said a word to me. Now, I can honestly say I don't know how I would have reacted to them if they had. I certainly hadn't done any of the kind of emotional sobriety work that helps a person deal with that kind of loving confrontation. But to me, it's a really sensitive topic in our program.
So Linda, the next question is very similar, but it might give you new kind of perspective. So the next one is, although we never really talk about weight loss in OA, it is of course something that we think about, as I'm sure others do. Where do you think weight loss might appear within these provocations?
I think weight loss would come in when someone has been coming, you've watched them come over the years and they are in the fat serenity mode, where they're getting the love and the belonging and the connection that we get in these rooms that is so, so precious to me, but they have not been able to get abstinent. And, you know, and I think the first question that I would ask of those kinds of people is, do you want to lose weight? Is that something you want to do? Because believe it or not, even though people bring themselves ostensibly to these rooms to lose weight, it can be a really tricky, particularly for people with trauma in their background, it can be really tricky. Weight loss feels like a threat. And so I would ask the person the question, you know, is that something that you're interested in? And is there any way that I can be helpful? I hope that helps. I hope that answers the question.
Here's another question that is, again, related. Hold on a second.
Okay.
It moved just a second. Okay. This is a three-part question.
Mm-hmm.
First, do you agree that people are in pre-lapse before relapse?
Yes.
The second part is, what is relapse? When do you know someone is in relapse? And then can someone say that he or she is recovered if they're in relapse?
No. Okay. So the first one is, yes, I do agree that people don't relapse. They go through prelapse first. Definitely. I absolutely 100% agree with that. That's absolutely been true in my own story. A relapse has never snuck up and bit me in the butt. I've always gotten there through a series of stages of steps. And what's the second question, Cher, please?
Hold on a second. It is, what is relapse, and when do you know when someone is in relapse?
For me personally, I see a difference between relapse and slips. My definition of abstinence is I abstain 100% from my alcoholic foods. And then I have a food plan that is a tool that I use to help me stay away from my alcoholic foods and to help me lose weight or maintain my weight loss. So my food plan is a tool. Abstinence is staying away from my alcoholic foods. Relapse for me is partaking of my alcoholic foods. A slip for me is eating too much fruit or eating too much, protein that was on my food plan. So those are the differentiations I make. So now knowing when someone else is in relapse, that's how I know I'm in relapse, is if I eat an alcoholic food. Knowing when someone else is in relapse is a much harder thing, and we don't know until we start seeing the weight creep on. That's how I would answer that. And then did I answer the third part of that question?
And then the third one is, can someone say that they are recovered, ED, while in relapse?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. They can say they're recovering, but I don't think you can say you're recovered if you're in the middle of relapse.
Okay, so I got a couple of these, and they say, how do or did you, and the you is emphasized, get abstinent?
Oh. Okay, so when I first came into program, I was 28. I got abstinent right away, lost 50 pounds, and I kept it off for 5 years, white knuckling my brains out. I never had a spiritual awakening. It was just a diet support group for me. I relapsed, and then I spent the next 20 plus years in relapse, in and out of OA multiple times, did all kinds of crazy crap trying to lose weight. It was just a mess. When then what I did is this is just my truth, people. What I did then is I went into an outside program, and I learned about the science of obesity and addiction. And it made step one completely real to me. It made it real, and it made me understand that I needed to stop expecting my body to do things that it can't do because I'm a food addict. And then I came back into program, and I read that line that I read to you today about, if the steps aren't working for you, then maybe you're working the steps in a way that doesn't work for you. When I read that, then I actually did the work of doing the steps in a way that worked for me. And so it was that conglomeration. And so it was learning at a very deep level my powerlessness, and coming to believe in a concept of a higher power that actually worked for me. And I had to work very, very hard to come to that place, because I don't have a traditional faith. I wasn't raised that way. It's not the way I think. And so I really had to really work hard at that. And once I did that, it's like click, 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 click. All the cogs came into place, and I worked the steps in a way I had never worked them before. I had a sponsor, but most of the work I did myself. And that's how I got abstinent. And it was a process. It was a process. And I know I shouldn't say this because I don't want to bum anybody out, because it might not be your story, but it took me a few years. I lost a bunch of weight, regained it all back, lost a bunch of weight, regained it all back. And then I came using the science, and then I came back into OA, and I married the science with with the spiritual solution of OA, and that allowed me to get abstinent. That was a long explanation for that question. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Linda. That really helped. But I want to say, I want to be sure this seems like a good time to talk about it. Starting in January, we will have sessions on the science of step 1, which talks about the exact science that Linda is talking about. You can sign up for it starting in October. And once again, it's free and it will be here on Surrender School. And I'm right now, the Surrender School board is going through the practice sessions that she does. And it's like blowing me away completely. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes not so much in a good way, but it's really like amazing. So anyway, that's in January. You want to be sure to sign up for that. Okay, here is another question. They're asking if you could elaborate on that concept of prelapse.
So I've never relapsed like just falling off a cliff. It's never happened to me like that. First, what happens is I start shorting myself on my quiet time. Then I start, maybe I don't measure that particular thing I put in the food plan. Then I start trying to get my effect, the effect that they talk about, that we'll talk about in step 1. I start trying to get my effect through overeating on my abstinent foods. And then I stop going to meetings, and then I fall over the cliff into relapse. So the prelapse for me, and the big book actually talks about this quite a bit. I can't remember if it's, I can't remember if it's in There's a Solution or more about alcoholism, where it talks about the mental states that precede a relapse. And you have to identify the ones that are yours. And I'm very clear on how mine work. And because I've relapsed dozens and dozens and dozens of times in this program before I recovered. And so I know pretty well how I do it for myself, but it is a gradual letting go of what we know works for us. And we just let it go a little bit at a time. And then boom, we find ourselves in relapse.
So Linda, can you say the saying that is if your program's not working for you, that saying on page 2?
Oh yeah, yes, I will. I love it. It's on page 2 in his study guide, and it's right underneath the section labeled the big book. And it's the second sentence there after that section title. He says, if the steps aren't working for you, then maybe you're not working the steps in a way that works for you. That was mind-blowing to me. I always thought that there was a right way or an only way or a true way. And what I found out is there's a way for me, and that's why I love doing all these different step studies, because I take bits and pieces from everywhere and make them my own and make them part of my program. I have rarely, pun intended, swallowed somebody else's program whole. I just don't do it. It doesn't work for me. Believe me, I've tried. I had to figure it out. And a good sponsor will help you do that.
So Linda, one of the people asked the question, is it good to go to things like emotional sobriety courses and stuff like that? I think you just answered that.
I think so, yes. I mean, for me, they were invaluable additions to my program. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that they're more important. That the basic part of the whole recovery program are the steps. They are the skeleton that we build everything else around. And without it, we would just be a pile of jelly. So we have to have the steps, but then there's all this other stuff around it that can help us work our steps, that can help us work our recovery programs. And I use all of it because it's all been invaluable to me. I am not.
Another.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. No, here's another question, because we do have quite a few. So if someone has a slip or relapse while working the steps, do they pick up where they left off, or do they go back to step 1, in your opinion?
If it's a relapse, a true relapse, like off into their alcoholic food, I'm a couple of different minds of this. I think it depends on the sponsee, but But if it's a true relapse, like a relapse where they go out and they leave OA and they go out there for a while and live in relapse, then I would say coming back in, you want to start at step one. If it's a one-time relapse, then it is something that needs to be looked at very carefully with your sponsor to see what's going on, where's the disconnect. Where do we need to go to? Maybe it isn't having to go back to step one. Maybe this is a step two issue where they really don't have a higher power they feel like they can trust. Or maybe it's a step three issue where they are fighting the notion that they don't have control over over most things, and that they're trying to control, and that frustration of not being able to control it led them back into the food. I think it's very specific to the sponsee. If someone slips, it's also something to look at very, very carefully with the sponsor, but I would then continue to move forward, because something that you're doing in the step work at that time made you uncomfortable enough to try and seek solace in some kind of food. So I think it would depend on where the sponsee is.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions that are similar to this, and that is that I have a traditional faith, but it's not working for me right now. I have trouble with the whole higher power concept. How do I get? There were several that asked, how do I get a higher power?
This is what I did. I mean, and it worked for me. I don't know if it'll work for you. All I can do is speak from my own experience. What I did was I started with the question, what do I believe about how the world works? How does the world work? How does it work? What can I believe? And I believe in the way that the natural laws of the planet work. If I drop an apple, it will fall to the floor. If I binge on, crap all day long, I'm going to get very big, very unhealthy, and very unhappy. That's a natural law. So behind those laws, though, there's a natural, and I'm not saying it's other focused, it's just there's a natural order to the way the world works. And if I align myself with that order, Herb K always talks about aligning. He does this, I love that. Aligning with the way the world works, aligning myself with the reality of it, that is a great power. I'm not fighting it, I'm aligning myself with that power. And from there, it sort of, it opened the door. I didn't have to have any theological debate about this power I was tapping into. And I made it very simple for myself. And then as I've grown in program, that kind of spirituality has grown more. And I think the definition of a good spirituality is one that you kind of can't define, because I have a really hard time talking about my higher power, like what it is and how I connect with it and tap into it. I almost feel like I'm plugging into it, like a literal plug, an electrical plug. There is just a magnificent life force on this planet, and if I align myself with it, it gives me great power. It's that power that I lack.
Thank you, Linda. So I'm going to move on to the next question. First of all, Francine, thank you for pointing that out. Also in the study guide on page 72, if you use the whole study guide, there's some questions that are there that are common questions that are asked where Lori C answers also. And obviously when he's here, he'll be able to answer more questions too. All right.
Yes.
So one more, Linda, is it possible to get recovered from compulsive eating and never relapse? Do you know of anyone who recovered and never relapsed?
I'm sure it's possible. I've never known anybody, but I'm absolutely positive it's possible. I just don't know anybody.
Okay, that was a short answer. Maybe I can ask another
I'm
question.
usually so talky. Yeah.
Okay. what is your feeling on counting days?
That's always an interesting question. I know my abstinence date. I don't keep track of the days in that, like I've, like back-to-back abstinence days. I don't do that. I know my date, my abstinent first date. I think some people get a lot out of doing that. I never did, because I tried so many times. What I did do, and I won't take the time to talk on that, but there are a lot of different opinions about that. I don't count days. I know my abstinent date, and that's all I've got. So I know my birthday. I know my abstinence birthday. But I couldn't tell you right now how many days that is.
Okay, so there is one more. I really like this question too. It just asked the question, is there advantage to having a food sponsor and a step sponsor and an emotional sobriety sponsor? Or do you think that doesn't keep it simple?
I think for some people that works. I have been people's food sponsor before. I've never been anybody's emotional sobriety sponsor other than being their regular sponsor. I myself, one, that takes a lot of time. And if you don't have a lot of time, I think that would be too much. If you have the time and the inclination and it works for you, then I would encourage you to do it. I myself, I don't parse it out because all of those things are so intimately connected that I want to talk to one person that knows my whole story in all of those places because they all fit together for me. So I would want one person if that poor person could handle it. That's how I would answer that.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm a big one on encouraging people to do what works for them. Do what works for you. If it works, there's no right or wrong. Do what works for you.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we are getting pretty close to the time. There's a lot of people that are asking, can you post your phone number and that kind of stuff? And I think rather than that, we really want, if at all possible, to drive everybody to go to Surrender School because there's always new stuff there. And we'll put up, I don't know, Joy, what you're going to do with this, but some kind of communication methodology where you can reach out to the different people that are at either the board or, oh, thank you, Teresa. I've forgotten about that. So, Teresa, can you talk about WhatsApp? She put it up there. We have a WhatsApp group. And so, Teresa, if you want to talk about that, if you can, that would be awesome.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Linda. Teresa, compulsive overeater. Karen will be posting in the chat, our chat poster, the WhatsApp link. And this link is just for the Surrender School group. Please, please, please join it so that you can communicate with each other in fellowship. You can ask questions there. Everyone here that's in Surrender School will be looking at it, pretty much every day, one of us, so we're one of them. I'm not in Surrender School, I'm just a tech person. So please use that and sign up now. Like just click on it and boom, 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 you're there. So that's really all I have. If you have any problems getting into WhatsApp or you do not have WhatsApp, it can't be used so far that I know on the iPad, but definitely on your desktop and your iPhone or Android phone. You could just send me a private chat and I can help you out with that. So go ahead and do that now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Teresa. So anyway, that is our main method of communication for within this group. And it allows you to chat with each other. And obviously, Linda and the rest of the Surrender School board will all be part of that. So Joy, I'm passing it off to you.
Oh, great. So today, after the meeting, and maybe other times too, we will be open for chatting and talking to each other. We will be polling you next week to see if you want to do some breakout rooms or if you want to have just a separate meeting. Those of you who would like to stay after the meeting, the chat will be completely open. It's just going to be us chatting. But we will call on people because there may be a lot of us. If there's not, then we won't do that. And we love you all. We're so glad that you're here. And everybody is in surrender school, including Teresa. We're all here with you. We're so glad you came today. Thanks. We'll leave it open and we're going to go ahead and close with the serenity prayer.
Wait.
Okay.
Wait, read pages 4 through 14 for next week.
And you get to close us out with a serenity prayer, Linda.
Oh, okay. Wonderful. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you all so much for coming.
See you next week.